Hello, everyone. This is Mason Richey from Asia Society Korea, and welcome to another installment of our Meet the Author series. This time we're going to be covering the nexus of strategy, statecraft, political economy, and security in the Asia Pacific. At least that's what we used to call it. I think now we're supposed to call it the Indo-Pacific, but to that end, we're going to be joined by Van Jackson. Dr. Van Jackson is Professor of International Relations at Victoria University of Wellington. His work looks broadly at politics of U.S. foreign policy, Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific security, theory, practice, merged together, questions of grand strategy. Many of you will probably already know him from two of his previous books. One with Cambridge Press, On the Brink, Trump, Kim, and the Threat of Nuclear War. He's also the author of Rival Reputations, Coercion and Credibility in U.S.-North Korea Relations from 2016. In addition to that, he's also written many journal articles, book chapters, policy reports, and things like that. One of the reasons why we're having him on today, in addition to his general expertise about these series of questions, is that he has a third book coming out, this time from Yale University Press, titled Pacific Power Paradox, American Statecraft and the Fate of Asian Peace. And so we're going to pick Van's brain on some of these questions of statecraft and strategy and political economy and security, I think that arise out of some of the work from this book. Of course, we'll link this into Korea and questions of the Korean Peninsula, although we'll also look more broadly here at the region. Van holds policy research appointments at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, the Defense and Strategy Fellow with the Center for Strategic Studies, Senior Associate with the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, and is also a non-resident Victoria University. He's taught Asian security, U.S. foreign policy, international relations at Georgetown, Hawaii Pacific University, Catholic University of America, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. He's served at the Center for New American Security, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and Pacific Forum CSIS. And prior to becoming a scholar, one of the reasons why I wanted to have Van on today is that he was a practitioner of U.S. foreign policy, working in the Defense Department at the Office of the Secretary of Defense's office from 2009 to 2014, and prior to that was serving in the U.S. Air Force from 2000 to 2006, during which time he spent at least a part of that, I believe, in Korea. So with that background and bona fides adequately explained, I'm going to go directly into it. And I'm just going to ask you, first of all, Van, to go ahead and tell us about your current book project. This is a Meet the Author discussion. So tell us about your upcoming book project.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is actually the first time I'm talking about it in any remotely meaningful way publicly. So the book, like the title suggests, documents what I call the Pacific Power Paradox, which is that American statecraft in Asia has simultaneously preserved regional peace, threatened regional peace, and embrittled regional peace over time. It's the three faces of the hegemon. And it matters because Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, Oceania, have not experienced a new interstate war since 1979. And we call this the Asian peace, or the Asia Pacific peace. It's very cool in its own right, but it's especially puzzling when you contrast it with the century and a half prior to 1979, because Asia was full of wars during that time, right? So a lot of scholars have kind of made it their mission to explain the puzzle of the Asian peace, like what's responsible for this phenomenon. We'd like more of it, you know? But most of those scholars who focus on the Asian peace per se have not really reckoned with America's role in the phenomenon. And that's where the book comes in, right? It's to investigate America's role in the Asian peace. And what it shows is that there's this conventional wisdom narrative in Washington about America as a security provider, as the oxygen that keeps Asia alive, America as a firefighter keeping the flames of war at bay. And this conventional wisdom is not wrong, but it's far more exception than norm. Like, just as often as the U.S. has been Asia's firefighter, it's been Asia's arsonist too. Anybody who lived through the North Korean nuclear crisis in 2017 knows this, right? And if we recognize that the nature of American hegemony in Asia has this paradoxical quality to it, it amounts to a change of narrative about America's role in Asia. And it is a revision of the conventional wisdom. But more than that, it actually unlocks policy possibilities for keeping Asia stable that historically have no traction whatsoever in Washington. So I'm thinking of like arms control, unilateral concession making, military restraint as statecraft, right? Confidence building with rivals, regional institutions that exclude the United States, God forbid, right? An economic statecraft that tries to deliver justice for the global South. Like, that kind of stuff is an enlightened statecraft. And yet it only really makes sense to do that kind of stuff when you understand that America is not just the hero who saves everyone with its military might and its resolve and its toughness. Like, if we allow ourselves to keep believing that kind of like heroic nonsense, we're going to mythologize our way into war, right? Kind of like 2017. So I'm kind of proposing a different way of understanding how we, America, relate to Asia, with the ultimate goal of making like us the force for good in the region that we've always imagined ourselves to be. So that's kind of the project in a nutshell.
Okay, there is a lot there that I would like to pick apart, and we certainly don't have time to get as deeply into to many of the things that you just mentioned as I want, obviously. And in my head, I'm sort of taken in a number of different directions as to where I want to go in my next couple of questions here, just kind of listening to you and writing down some notes. And one goes off in, for lack of a better term, I want to call it like a political direction. And it's also in some sense a policy-making direction, and to the extent that policy-making in some sense derives from domestic political incentives and domestic political constraints, but also a sort of institutionalization of the way that people in policy-making positions go about doing their business. And so that kind of sausage making, I think we can come back to that, but I'm just going to go ahead and throw that out there. And if you want to pick up on this in some way, you're welcome to, but we can also save it for later. And that's, you talk about, U.S. hegemony, you talk about stability and the role of the U.S. as a force for good in many respects. And I think what's going on in the background, this hegemony is declining, or in some sense is already eclipsed. And in my head, I keep thinking, it doesn't seem like Washington has fully accepted that, or has even begun to really accept that. So when you're talking about these positive possibilities that you think can be unlocked, it seems like the key for unlocking them is, in the first place, I won't say necessarily accepting, but at least learning to live with relative decline and adapting to that. And so one of the things that's going on in the back of my head is, how can that be possible? The other thing I think that really kind of sticks out in my head is this question of economic justice, which you bring up. And here I'm just, I'm looking at the case of the U.S. and not to just look at the U.S., but also a country like Canada, which is experiencing this sort of truckers' revolt, it seems like. Yeah. And in my head, I don't see a lot of political space for the types of steps towards global economic justice that it seems like you think, again, could open up some of these possibilities, because we find a sort of, MAGA Trump ethos in the U.S. or in Canada or in other places, which make this type of, bold global economic justice movement more complicated. And then the third thing I think you talk about, as you say, God forbid, security arrangements or economic arrangements that don't involve the U.S. And I myself have written things about mini-lateral arrangements that might not involve the U.S. or at least where the U.S. is not a frontline partner. But it seems like even there, we're sort of seeing that trend in the opposite direction. I mean, AUKUS is clearly the U.S. is a critical part of this. The Quad, again, a critical part of this. And it seems like the one area where we don't see the U.S. Playing such a big role is, in fact, in economics and trade, where the U.S. is not a part of RCEP, where it's not a part of the CPTPP. So those are sort of the three areas, I guess, that immediately come to mind when I hear you, give your sort of elevator pitch for the book. So any of those three things you want to pick up on and comment on, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, all three, depending on how much time we have. But I guess a good place to start would be that we have to be clear that the reason for America's kind of inner turmoil when it comes to economic strategy or a lack of economic strategy, it has to do with the fact that our economic statecraft for the past 40 years, especially in Asia, has been totally in service of neoliberalism, right? The ideology of the primacy of capital over workers, over labor, over even government decision-making in civil society, right? Globalization itself was justified intellectually on the back of neoliberalism. And our policies and our foreign policy has been in service of this, right? And so the problem with that is we live in an era now that is defined in totally post-neoliberal terms. Politics now is not amenable to neoliberal policy prescriptions of austerity and privatizing electricity grids and that kind of stuff, right? And so that leaves us in an intellectual rut, the U.S., because the people making Asia policy, including when I was doing it myself, we grew up in the ideology of neoliberalism. It was a bipartisan consensus. We didn't even have the term neoliberalism floating around in our discourse, right? So the policymakers that are currently staffing the Biden administration, they don't have really an alternative vision for political economy, except a kind of throwback to a New Deal order or Keynesianism, which is kind of what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's trying to do. It's kind of what Biden's trying to do, but they're trying to do it with staff who are overwhelmingly neoliberals by immersion, by training or whatever, right? So America is stuck in this place where it doesn's have a vision for the economy. It knows it wants to shape rules because every hegemon wants to shape rules. It's still engaged in this project of preserving its own primacy or what's left of it. And then like you suggested in your comments, I think that's part of the problem. We have to get out of our own way a little bit. And so if you're committed to a project of preserving what remains of American primacy in Asia, you're not going to be interested in, compromise with adversaries. You're not going to be interested in order building unless you're at the center of it all. And so that's the difficulty. We don't have an economic vision. We're committed to primacy in all respects, but we don't have primacy in all respects. So our hands are tied in certain ways. And the result is that we conduct an economic policy that looks inconsistent at times and definitely lacks vision. And we don't have a story to tell about economics. And that is clearly what the region wants. In no small part because that's where China has established its own centrality more than any other domain.
So maybe this gets us off on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think we can circle it back around and to talking about some of the regional issues here, which you bring up at the end of this, but at the end of your comments. But to what extent do you think there is something, let's say, positive or catalyzing, let's say, about the domestic U.S. Political situation. Notably, right of center, where you find a significant part of the U.S. working class who has, found out, they would maybe not use these terms, I don't know, but has found out that there was something empty about the neoliberal promise for them, right? To what extent is there something that could in some way be liberating for U.S. economic policy? I personally don't look at, a lot of the Trump voters who come out of this experience as necessarily doing a lot of good things for the U.S., whether that be in terms of economics or politics or race relations or any number of other things, and that spills over to the way that the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world too. But to what extent is there something potentially catalyzing about that, where there is a way that this could be a force for good? That maybe there's this sort of this tremor, this cataclysm that came along with the MAGA movement that could end up breaking something open in the U.S. that could spill over to its foreign policy and economic policy outside of the U.S., or is this just unfortunately likely to keep spiraling down into a destructive direction?
Yeah, so this is the opportunity that the American left is blowing, and the opportunity that even liberals who are not neoliberals are kind of blowing, is that we had the 4 decade, and even, Frank, Republicans are basically the only people who are taking advantage of this opportunity, but in the most demagogic, authoritarian kind of way. So globalization is a obviously global phenomenon, and it's been neoliberal globalization or globalized neoliberalism, right? 4 decades of this. And that has produced, that's why we get the global far right as a problematic. So Trump is a symptom of this old way of doing economic policy, right? The far right backlash that you mentioned, the truckers, right? We're actually dealing with that in New Zealand too. The exact same phenomenon right now, squatting in the Capitol. The far right phenomenon is global because it's responding to a global pressure, which is neoliberal globalization. And so worker precarity, financial volatility, austerity politics, debt accumulation, privatizing public services, that's neoliberal political economy. That's what American politics consensus supported for a long time, right? And the problem with all of that is, of course, is that it ultimately culminates in people like Trump. All of it fuels ethno-nationalism and kleptocracy and reactionary forces in societies everywhere, right? And then that's the stuff that wars are made out of. And so we have an opportunity to respond to it and to not have to do austerity politics, to reduce wealth inequality, to improve working conditions so that the majority of workers in Asia are not on the informal economy and precarious and lacking welfare benefits or labor union rights, right? It's we can make a more stable, more just situation, and we're technically free to, because we are not enthralled to neoliberalism anymore. It's not, there are forces of neoliberalism still in the global political economy, but it's not politically popular, right? And Trump and the far right are proving that, because they are leveraging anti-globalization messages, right? The far right is very much against neoliberalism now after being for it. And so the problem is, of course, they're not providing solutions except authoritarian ones, except for anti-democratic ones, right? Except for ones that worsen inequality. And so it's a problem that sane, rational politics should be able to respond to, because there's an opportunity to spend money, to build back better, et cetera, but you have to actually do it. And we're not. And in part, it's because we're not interested in naming the problem. We're not interested in anchoring our prescriptions to a diagnosis of globalization and past policies of having created this world that we are now trying to respond to. And the right is coming closer to doing that than the left. So it's very hard to, I'm speaking to you as a policy analyst guy. but the policy is embedded in a world of politics that we can no longer fully get away from. Like, we have to be aware of this stuff as part of the analysis, I think.
Fair enough. I have some questions. I don't think we have time to get to. I mean, one of them is you began in some sense to gesture at the end by saying, I'm speaking to you as a policy analyst. You use the term we. We're not interested in doing this and that. I'm somewhat interested in who this we is. I think that's doing a lot of work, but I don't think we have time to get into it. I guess the short answer is people will just have to buy your book in order to find out who this we is. So there's a plug for you, by the way. To kind of bring this back to the region, since you said in your prior set of remarks, in your estimation, the region here in the Asia Pacific is looking for economic solutions that move beyond neoliberalism, economic solutions to obviously the pressures that come perhaps from China, that come from financial capital, to bring it back to the region, if we, so I guess I would say two things. One is simply a sort of a question, I guess, or a statement, or sort of an assessment of what you just said, which is that in some sense the U.S. is a sort of confused mess on political economy, globally and regionally here. And then secondly, I guess the question that derives from that for the region is, can you dive down a little bit into the effects that this has on U.S. relations, in particular with its allies, with its partners, even with, let's say neutral countries. And if you want to throw in the way that this affects the U.S. rivalry with China, that would also be welcome as well.
Yeah, I mean, confused mess on economic policy is like a very appropriate description on how all this affects the region, or, allies, partners, actually enemies too. Like, there's a few different ways, I think, to think about this. One is that we need a term for it, like the economic contradictions or the economic chaos of American economic statecraft. Like, it has diminished America's value to Asia, right? So there was always this fear, going back to the early Cold War even, that America would become the Hessians of Asia. Like, our value proposition to the region would be that we're the best at killing, and we're military mercenaries, and we're not much more than that. That was the fear, that's how things would evolve, right? And it hasn't been true, but over the past 20 years, it's become more and more true. And that's the trend line, right? So that's a problem, because as our value narrows to military stuff, our influence also narrows. So we have less and less ability to shape the environment, shape political life in Asia. We want to change the rules, but we can't, kind of thing, right? We ask allies to do stuff, but we have a hard time getting them to say yes, because we don't have ways to incentivize them to do what we want, right? So that's a function of becoming the Hessians of Asia, the military mercenaries. That's what we're valuable for if you're the modal, Asian government, right? Second, and this is all related, our economic drift impacts Asia through its disproportionate empowerment of China, right? So after the Asian financial crisis, this is all in the book too, actually, in 97, 98, that's when the region decided to double down, because they saw us as responsible for it disproportionately, that crisis. They doubled down on China as an economic counterweight to the U.S., right? And Chinese money in the region is not all bad, but there's a lot of good that it can do if it's harnessed the right way. But the political influence that China gets from its economic heft is unquestionably a front-burning concern for the United States. Whether it should be, that's a separate debate, but it is of concern. But the reason it even happens, the reason China even gets that influence, is because the region needed to turn somewhere for trade and investment, and Japan was in a recession in the 90s, and America was ceding, giving up the economic ground, basically, because it could do nothing except neoliberalism, right? And then the other thing was like, economic statecraft is the only way to make a more durable Asian peace, ultimately, right? Reduce wealth inequality, end kleptocracy and oligarchy, renegotiate debt burdens, right? That's real economic statecraft. But that's the kind of stuff, and that's the kind of stuff that's upstream of rivalry and war. That's the basis on which you build a durable order. And ultimately, I think economic development is how you sort of reduce ethno-nationalist tripwires and clash of civilization geopolitics, right? But the development needs to be a kind of more balanced, egalitarian development, not just within countries, but between the global north and the global south too. And the U.S. is not doing any of that kind of stuff with economic policy. It's doing sanctions and like vaccine donations here and there. And like, that's kind of it, right? And as a result, it's allowing Asia to be brittle and hyper-militarized, right? So if you look at a country like Korea, they are in this strange order that John Eikenberry calls like the dual hierarchical order, right? America has security centrality in Asia, security provider of choice, if you happen to be an ally. And then China is the economic provider of choice in a sense, right? Even though our fates are more interlinked than we would like to acknowledge. And so states like South Korea are kind of trapped in this hedging posture where they're trying to appeal to the US for security and to China for economics. And that's a really difficult balancing act to pull off. And it's really only possible. What we're talking about is two hegemons in one region. And they only get to coexist because they're hegemons in different domains of life. And that's a very uneasy thing to try and navigate. And long term, I don't know that it actually works because it requires that peaceful coexistence between the great powers that is increasingly fraught or difficult, and so it's the middle powers and the smaller states who ultimately get cornered or get trapped.
So, yeah, I want to come back to that last point. It's interesting. You go back, talk about the Asian financial crisis, 97, 98. I don't know if you're familiar with a book that I want to say came out in the early 2000s. I could be wrong. It's been a long time since I've read it, called Panic Rules by a sort of alternative economist. I don't even remember which university, Robin Hanel, if I remember correctly. And it's funny because the book starts with 2 pages. I think, one of them is like a recto and then the other is the verso. And the first is, in any financial, in any, impending financial crisis, there are 2 rules. The first one is don't panic, and the second one is panic first. And he sort of uses that as sort of the modus operandi for how the crisis ended up becoming a conflagration, moving, if I remember correctly, from the Thai baht through Malaysia, and then I don't remember exactly the order in which it went, but eventually a country like Korea sort of finds itself getting crushed by something, in theory that was simply traced back to, a massive decline in the Thai baht, which is sort of, unexpected series of circumstances. So I find it a little bit interesting that if you're, Korea, you somehow blame the U.S. for this. And for what it's worth, in Korea to this day, they still call it the IMF crisis, which is kind of, interesting insofar as, arguably that might not have necessarily been the origin of the problem. So you talk about the Korea, among other countries being sort of trapped in this hedging posture. And so, and you lay out the security dimension of this and the economic dimension of this, tracking in some ways, the relationship with the U.S. and the relationship with China. Sort of, a couple of things come out of that, I think, that are worth, pondering over a little bit. One is a sort of, for lack of a better term, a policy question and a practical question for a country like Korea. And then the second is maybe a bit more, historical or theoretical. And so I believe it was former KNDA Chancellor Kim Jong-un who was in Washington at CSIS, and he was asked by someone, something to the effect of, how is South Korea progressing in diversifying itself away from its trade dependence on China, which is roughly something like 25%.
Yeah.
And he said, look, it's hard. He said, look, we're aware that this is a problem and we're working at it, but it's hard. And he said, honestly, in the few years that, we've been trying to, to diversify supply chains and try to move away from this, it's been really hard. And honestly, like, you don't really see the statistics showing that we're making much progress in this regard. And this is, despite the new Southern policy with Korea looking towards Southeast Asia, it's, despite efforts to grow, the economic relations with other parts of the world. So, it's interesting you use the word trapped in the sense that, to some degree, it seems like these are some really sticky, institutionalized, and historically path-dependent problems that are challenges or obstacles that are really hard to get around. Yeah. So to some degree, I guess my first sort of practical question would be, what else ought a country like Korea be? What should it be doing otherwise, if anything? And the second thing is, this is a bit more historical, but to what extent is what you just described when you talk about a country like Korea, and obviously there are other countries as well, for whom this description would fit, when they find themselves in a region where there are two hegemons, who are in this kind of, power transition window, you refer to them as being trapped. Hasn't it always historically been thus? I mean, what in some sense is different about the situation now? Or alternately, to the extent that this is in some sense a repetition of what might have been happening earlier in other time periods in other regions, what can we learn from the history of international relations in these situations about how it is that countries like Korea can potentially extricate themselves from these problems, or to the extent that they can't, what tends to happen to them?
Yeah, the more you look to history, the more depressing you should be. Right now, we're if you think of us being in like the ebb of the unipolar moment, a world that is defined in terms of America's sort of economic ideology. It places America at the center by good fortune and design, and individual nations make their own best decisions, but it all redounds back to a system that had America at its center. That's literally hegemony, like your decisions that are optimized for you somehow strengthen the system kind of thing, right? So that's the system within which China is taking greater and greater market share of economic influence. And so the way that America has gone about reproducing its own hegemony has undermined its ability to maintain economic hegemony. Like it is by the early 2000s, more or less, lost that in the political economic realm. So the conditions that we're in now are just very different from the Cold War, especially the first half of the Cold War. But there is a way in which small states in the early Cold War also faced this dilemma, right? This is what you gestured at, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's like, where do you fall on that line? Well, that's where the Third World emerged as a movement, as a post-colonial movement. And it was the Third World that had a vision for a new international economic order that it tried to push that would have been more just, more favorable, deferential to the global South. And it would have provided a kind of inclusive development for these countries so that they didn't have to do what the Asian miracle economies did, which was by and large merge authoritarian power with capitalism, subvert labor, and you get big growth, but it's on the back of extreme inequality, right? It's this kind of unsustainable economic development model. That authoritarian capitalism model, it was the alternative in some ways to the new international economic order. The U.S. prevented that from happening. And so when we look at killed the NIEO, right? And so the third world never had that chance to build that alternative vision for how to sort of get along in the world. And it's that alternative vision that is needed now. The third world non-aligned bloc, we need the equivalent of that now, right? It's a little less severe because China is part of the capitalist world. China is offering a different version of capitalism in essence. It's not the communist versus free world dichotomy that we had back in the day. And so we're missing that third way. Well, that's a bad phrase. We're missing the third option in the current moment. And so that's what's needed. And if you don't have it, you really are trapped. The third way is the imagined alternative to being trapped. It just didn't work out as great in the Cold War. It doesn't mean it couldn't work now, but we don't really see individual nations like Korea trying to build some alternative order because they're still pretty invested in the status quo,
Well, we can talk about the domestic political situation in Korea and how that's related to the chaebol and the oligarchy in Korea and how that affects the political system here. Perhaps another time. Unfortunately, we actually have
Samsung, by the way. Just saying.
So and by the way, Tony Blair thanks you for the third way. He's really happy. He hasn't been relevant in about 15 years, and all of a sudden you're gonna make him start trending again. Okay, look, we've actually got a little bit less time than I wanted. I know you have something else that you have to do. I know that you're in demand. So I'm gonna kind of hit you a little bit from a different direction here. And sort of one question I think will lead to the other. And I'm just gonna hit it real directly. Is the U.S. bad at strategy? Or bad at statecraft, if you want to use that term, or if you want to put it differently, has the U.S. become bad at strategy? Has the U.S. become bad at statecraft? Why am I right? If I am right, why is that the case? What are the pathologies that are undermining the U.S.'s ability to be strategically sound?
Dude, that's such a big question.
And you have about 2 minutes to answer it too. So.
Yeah. So just to give you an answer, I would say the short answer is yes, but it depends on how cynical you want to be, right? America's non-strategy strategy, especially in the economic realm, it works perfectly fine for people who are plutocrats or people who have tremendous wealth. Or for multinational corporations or agricultural interests in the U.S. or for big pharma companies in the U.S. There are certain interests who benefit tremendously from the existing order as it is, even in the absence of a strategy. So the non-strategy is actually a good strategy if you are a corporate interest or person of means, but if you think in terms of a national interest or what does the middle class want or need or that kind of thing, it looks like a terrible strategy. The non-strategy is a huge problem, and so the question, I guess, would be why? You've mentioned pathologies, and there's a bunch that I can think of. One being groupthink in DC. There's a tremendous lack of intellectual diversity in Washington. This owes a little bit to neoliberalism, actually, the notion of bipartisanship on foreign policy being a virtue, which mercifully is starting to change, but that created an environment of self-censorship. There is an over-reliance on the military to solve problems, and that's going to happen when you give it $768 billion and, demand a global basing presence. that's going to stunt your imagination for how to deal with policy. And so American policy action is really biased toward the symptoms of geopolitics rather than thinking in terms of like underlying causes of insecurity, which would be a more public policy thing rather than national security thing, right? So the size of the military and the reliance on the military feeds back on itself. And that really like limits what we think we can even do. But there's a historical dimension to that. So in the 80s, Ronald Reagan, he took a deliberately high cost, high risk strategy approach to the Soviet Union, but to Asia in particular. And as part of that, he embraced explicitly arms racing and brinkmanship. And like, there's nothing more combustible than those two paths. Like those are the main pathways that risk war, you know? And a lot of the older foreign policy experts in Washington now, those Reagan years were like their formidable experience, right? So like we won the Cold War. We got what we wanted. We did not have to cash in on those risks. We didn't have to pay a price for taking big, expensive military risks. And so I think this is not written about
survivor bias, basically. They were right before,
yes.
So why wouldn't they be right now? Yeah.
That's exactly right. And so survivor bias, great term, it has led to the wrong lesson learning, you know, and they think that we can do everything is a contest of resolve. Everything is a contest of out-arming and overmatch. Right. And if that's how you frame problems, then you're going to lean on the military and you're going to not even look at other problems. You're only going to look at stuff that can be solved with the military. And that's the trap that I feel like we're it's the trap that we're very much in now.
So you began an answer to my question by talking about this like very cynical, you know, or explicating this very cynical approach where, you know, a non-strategy strategy is extremely beneficial for, I don't know, name your plutocrat, right? Name your oligarch, you know, whether it be George Soros or Peter Thiel or Bezos or you know, whoever. In some way, I mean, obviously that's an answer to my question, and I'm sure that there's something to it. Although weirdly enough, you know, in my head when I ask that question, I'm actually kind of looking at this sort of like, I don't know how to put it, like low senior level of, you know, government official, I don't know, you know, assistant secretary of whatever. And I kind of think to myself, like, I don't think that those people go to work in the morning thinking, okay, like, what does Peter Thiel want me to do, right? Like, you know, what does Jeff Bezos think that I should be doing? And yet at the end of the day, formally speaking, those are people who have their hands on the lever in some way. And I guess to some degree, you know, part of what I'm asking when I say, is the U.S. bad at strategy, is I'm asking, like, what is it about the sausage making of U.S. strategy generally, but let's say in our particular case with respect to the, you know, Indo-Asia Pacific, you know, what is it that's, you know, preventing there from being, you know, better strategic decision making? And obviously, of course, you know, to some degree, you know, at the end of the day, whether it be, you know, Biden or the people around him or any other president, I mean, obviously at the end of the day, they're the ones who have, you know, the tightest grip on the lever, or at least the one that's most influential. But, you know, obviously, you know, if you're president, you can't just make stuff happen, right? You have to have, you know, down the chain of command, you have to have people, you know, actually pull the levers for you. I mean, that was one of the things that Trump learned. Like a lot of his worst instincts, he actually couldn't realize precisely because the people that were in government didn't do what it is that he wanted to do. Like I'm thinking this, you know, famous phone call where Mattis got off the phone and said, we're not going to do any of that stuff that he just said he's going to do. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, you know, you have a background, you know, in the you know, Office of the Secretary of Defense. You know, you obviously have a think tank background in, you know, in Washington. You know, how do those worlds play off of each other in such a way that we get this kind of blinkered strategic approach coming out of the U.S. government?
Yeah, again, easy question. So in theory, think tanks have this mission of public education, right? Their legal status in the U.S. at least requires that mission. But in practice, foreign policy think tanks, which also produce the staff who become political appointees in presidential administrations for the most part. Like, foreign policy think tanks tend to be extremely elitist and insular and kind of willfully technocratic, like obtusely technocratic. And the thing is, if you're sitting at a think tank as a fellow or a senior fellow, like, your job is not to sit around and think big thoughts. Your job is to get that money, like to fundraise. Someone's got to pay for the research, and you've got to build a public profile because that makes it easier to get that money, right? And you've got to peddle your influence with decision makers. That's how you be relevant, right? And so if you're not doing at least two of those things, you're not going to be a successful think tank person, policy wonk. And the most valuable thing is to have insider access. But unfortunately, that means any ideas you have for policy cannot be too antagonistic to people in power, right? Policymakers don't give critics insider access. And so there's a way in which think tanks are supposed to be the ideas industry to like shape and guide foreign policy for the government. But then the power imbalance makes think tankers very solicitous of government officials. And if you're in the government side, like when I was sitting in the Pentagon, you're not really looking to think tanks to produce new ideas. Like, it happens sometimes, but what you really want is to triangulate expert opinion on issues like North Korea policy or China policy, right? If all of the opinion makers and pundits and subject matter experts, if they all agree or disagree about some issue, you as a policymaker want to know that, but then you also want to shape those experts, those opinion makers. So how do you do that? Well, you give think tankers inside access, right? You invite them to briefings. You do pre-strategy rollout consultations and all this stuff, and on the margins, maybe you actually incorporate a couple of their ideas sometimes, right? But the ideas is not the point. And so as a policymaker, you are cultivating think tankers as part of your own elite social network. And also, you're going to need a job when you get out of that administration in 4 or 8 years. It'll probably be at a think tank, right? And so you network, but you're also using them as a force multiplier for whatever decisions and choices you're already trying to implement as part of your agenda. So like, you want the experts' help in selling your policies. And that is, in my experience, the essential nature of government think tank relations. And there are exceptions. There are hybrid places like Asia Society or think tanks that are international networks, so they take the public facing mission very seriously. They're not as focused on the insider access game, right? But those places are not the norm. Like, I have just never seen anyone get insider access with any presidency purely on the basis of their brilliant ideas. Like, it just doesn't happen, So that's a system that is corrupt, but not corrupt in like a pay to play way. It's corrupt in a like group thinky self-censorship kind of way. And that makes change really hard.
That's a distressing conclusion. It
kind of reminds, as honest as possible. I don't know if that.
I would expect nothing less. It actually, your description, it kind of reminds me of this famous aphorism from Theodore Adorno. I think it was in Minimum Moralia. He writes with him, "Wrong life cannot be lived rightly." In this sense, it's like, there's no way to get where you want to be when things are so foobar that there's really no pathway to the place you want to be. So two last very brief questions. I know you got to go. This is a meet the author experience for all of our Asia Society Korea viewers. Just real quick, you have this really interesting background, policy, think tank, scholarly, military. Who are you? How did you put this together? This strange CV. And then secondly, if you can tell us when the book comes out and give us a very brief 30-second explanation for why we should buy it.
So I grew up poor and the military was my way out of the hood. I went to the Air Force recruiter. I told the guy I wanted to be James Bond. He laughed at me, but he signed me up for this language aptitude test. I did well on the test. I did not become James Bond, but then that's how I got a job working in intelligence in the Air Force, coming out of high school, basically. And so the Air Force trained me up as a Korean linguist. I did that for 6 years. I was going to school at night. Right, Asian Studies major, IR major. And the Air Force paid for my undergrad degree and for my first master's. And I got out of the military and I was doing management consulting by day to pay the bills. And I was studying for an MBA at night to get like a second master's. I don't know. And I hated all of it. Like I hated the MBA. I hated management consulting. But up to that point, I had like really enjoyed university education. Before the MBA, right? And kind of like some of my only happy moments were deep reading on diplomatic history or political philosophy. And so I decided I was going to chase that high and a better way to say it is like, do what you love. And so I decided to study for a PhD because I would get to do that deep reading, even though I knew I was never going to finish the PhD. Like, I'm just not that smart, right? And around that time, I also decided that I was going to quit consulting and I was going to take this like really low paying research associate job. And it was because the research associate job was at a think tank called the Center for a New American Security. And I got the interview for the job. I didn't actually get the job, but this happened to be early 2009. Obama just became president. Obama hired basically all of CNAS, the think tank, all of their staff as political appointees in his administration. And because of that, I got tipped off from one of the interviewers about a position as a foreign policy advisor in this place called the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Right. And so I worked in the Pentagon. I got that job, worked in the Pentagon as a strategist and policy advisor for 5 years. It was very cool in some ways, but it was like an 80, 90 hour a week job. And I was still doing my PhD at night. It was not a sustainable kind of life. So I transitioned back to CNAS, but as a fellow. So I was formally in the think tank world as soon as I finished my PhD, which was back in 2014. And then I was teaching at night at Georgetown and doing the think tank life stuff until all of a sudden, Trump won the presidency in 2016 and like the world turned upside down. And I was like, maybe now's the time for a good life adventure. And so I just happened to be applying to academic jobs at that point in time just to see what was out there. One of those academic jobs happened to be Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And I got it and they wanted an answer quick. And I'm looking at a Trump presidency just getting ready to start. And I was like, let's do this. And that's how I ended up here.
Fascinating story. Glad to hear that. Well, I think finally we're going to have to let you go. You've been more than generous with your time, Van. So I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining us. Van, the title of the book again is The Pacific Power Paradox, correct? With Yale University Press. When's that going to be out?
There's supply chain issues with the paper that's delaying it. It's supposed to be November, December, but I think it's going to get pushed to early next year. We'll see.
All right, so late 2022, early 2023, depending on whether or not we can solve our paper supply chain issues. What is this, like 1450? Why are we having paper supply chain issues? You would have thought that we would have solved this before, yet here we are. In any event, I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining us for this Meet the Author with Van Jackson. I hope that you've learned something about U.S. statecraft in Asia, the Asian piece, which of course, as someone myself who lives in Korea, I hope continues for quite some time. And we hope that you will join us for another installment of this series, as well as for all of the other Asia Society Korea events that we have planned for this spring and throughout the rest of the year. Thanks a lot, everyone.